Hi, it's Lynn Shuck with Healing and Balance. We're going to be looking at figure 4, lying on your back. I'll get to that in a moment, but what I want us to pay attention to is movements of the pelvis that we might not be aware of. And then we're going to try and lessen those movements. And in lessening those movements, you'll actually start to build strength at the hip. You'll build strength in your torso and in your legs, but you'll be building strength deep in the pelvis and with the hip flexors. So those movements, the 3 movements that tend to happen, these are compensations we make when we don't have enough ability to make that figure 4. One is we start to tilt the pelvis backward. And so the top of the pelvis goes back and the back goes flat on the floor. Another movement is one hip comes forward while the other one goes back. So one hip lifts away from the floor. And the last movement is that one hip might lift towards your shoulder. You might list. So you could tilt, you could twist, or you could list. All of those can happen while you're on the floor, and I'm showing them to you upright because it's very hard to see them on the floor. I've tried taking the mat away. I've tried wearing different clothes. It's hard to see. So here we go. The figure 4 stretch is usually one ankle crossed over the other, and then you pick up the bottom leg. But we're going to break that down into its component movements, and we're going to see what happens. Before we even do that, the first component is setting up with your legs bent. When you bend your legs, does your pelvis tilt backward? Does the top of your pelvis press into the floor, flattening your back? Can you lessen that? Can you start to lift the top of your pelvis away from the floor without lifting the ribs? So we don't want to get up into a big arch. We're just seeing if we can get the pelvis to come a little bit more level. You'll have your sacrum on the floor, your lower ribs on the floor, and a little bit of curve in the lumbar. Now that you've established that position, that's what we want to try and maintain. So we're going to start by picking up one leg, just picking it up and putting it back down, and noticing, does your pelvis twist, one hip lifting off the floor? Does your pelvis tilt, meaning the top of the pelvis going toward the floor as you pick up your leg? Or does the pelvis list with one hip coming toward your shoulder? As you do that, let's go ahead and switch legs, and you discover that there's movement. Can you make it less? Some of that lessening of movement can happen by pressing your supporting foot into the floor. The rest of it's going to be actively engaging muscles in your torso to keep your pelvis still. So that's the first movement, is just picking your legs straight up, creating flexion at the hip. The next movement, once you've created flexion and lessened any movement in your pelvis, can you create external rotation without that movement? And sometimes this is where the tilting or the twisting or the listing shows up here in that rotation. Try the other leg. We bring it up with as little movement as possible, and then we rotate. And as you turn the thigh out, the foot staying in close to center, does your pelvis want to move? So once we've created how much movement do we have to pick our leg up, how much movement do we have to rotate it, and we're working toward less, the last part of setting up is bringing your ankle onto the thigh of your other leg. Now in doing that, you have to really use your hip flexors in this rotated position. And often that's where people will tilt the pelvis back to get their leg on. Let's try the other side. Pick the leg up, just straight flexion, then rotate, actively trying to lessen the rotations, the movements of the pelvis rather, and then trying to bring the ankle onto the thigh. I have less ability with my left leg than with my right. I have to actually slightly internally rotate my thigh to get my foot on there because I just don't have great mobility and strength in that leg. So we've done that. And if we want to build more strength, we could make this more active. So it's already active trying to get into the pose more so than it has been because you're paying attention. But once your leg gets in place and your knee is going that way and your ankle's getting pushed this way, before we even lift that other foot off the floor, can you pull this leg towards you off your thigh without moving, without changing the shape? And I can't. You'll notice I have to turn my leg in a little to pull my foot off my thigh. And I'm trying to turn it less and to turn it less, but I don't have a lot of movement in that direction. Watch what happens when we do the other leg. I pick it up, I turn it out, I put my ankle in place on this leg that's got more limitations, I press my knee that way, heel's coming this way, and then I try and pull towards me. Nothing happens. I'm going to still take that knee in. Nothing happens. I have to bring the knee in a lot to pull my heel off, my ankle off my thigh, because I can't even move it here. I don't have the strength yet. So I work where I can. I allow for the compensation, but then I keep working toward less of that compensation. And for me, the compensation is don't rotate your legs so much. If those are all pretty easy for you, you've gotten to where your pelvis stays really still, all parts of the preparatory work, you have the strength to pull your foot off your leg while you're sitting here. What if you came up into the pose? Now at this point, the lower back might flatten a little bit toward the floor. We're trying not to do it much, but it might. While you're here, I'm going to use my hands because I want to show you what you're going to do. Could you make that same movement with your own, just with your leg strength? I cannot. That's why I'm using my hands to introduce the movement, to teach my joints and muscles they can go this way, even though they don't have the strength yet. And we try the other side. Little movement, little movement, little movement in the pelvis. Get myself set up. As I bring my leg up, I try not to flatten my back on the ground, even though it does a little bit. And then again, I'm going to use my hands because I don't have the leg strength. Even with my hands, I can barely make this movement. It is so tight. So I'm just introducing the movement. I'm giving sort of an impression to my muscles and joints and bones. But if you have the ability, you could work on the strength there. So a whole progression of observation and strengthening at the hip joint in flexion and rotation. I don't have a name for that. We're just going to call this a figure 4 observation and strength work. Still clunky. Okay, that's what I have for you today. Go.